So this conversation is really about the research that could help improve public policy. Certainly, we've been talking about policy over the last day or so, and really excited to have these three panelists weigh in from their perspective. So Nan, Stan yesterday chatted a little bit about the Second Chance Business Coalition. I wanted to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about SEBC, and then we'll turn to the great work that JPMorgan Chase has been doing in this space.
Sure. One of the reasons that the JPMorgan and Eaton came together to co-found the Second Chance Business Coalition is because we recognize, even though we were doing second chance hiring or fair chance hiring in our firm, and we do it at a tremendous scale, roughly 10% of our new hires for the last 4 or 5 years are individuals with records that fit within our regulatory framework. Last year that was about 3,200 people. But even at that scale, we recognize that if we worked with other large companies, that is really how we could create change at scale. So that was the reason behind the Second Chance Business Coalition. And now I think if you go on the website, we're at over 50 large companies at this point that are dedicated to improving their hiring practices and advancement strategies within their own firms. And you know, we recognize that there is a lot that we can learn from each other. And as I think also this room reflects the fact, as I look around the room, I see so many people that the firm has learned from, and I personally have learned from in terms of what we could do better. And, you know, we're constantly working to improve our own, internal strategies and practices. The one other point that I would just make about the Second Chance Business Coalition, we can get into this a little bit more. There's a lot of resources that are available to employers of any size on the website, whether it's a playbook that you can look at to go through to see if you're already doing some of those things or additional practices that you could take part in. We have a partners map. You can look to see wherever it is that you're doing hiring, if there's a partner there that you could work with depending upon what your needs are in the individual markets where you're doing that hiring. There's a legal considerations guide, which, you know, oftentimes the legal team is your first stop when you're trying to implement second chance hiring. So there are a tremendous amount of resources available to companies that are trying to do this. And then the one thing, and we can touch on this a little bit more later, but we're really leaning into ecosystems. And it was brought up, earlier, here in Chicago, we were working with the Corporate Coalition, our tremendous hosts here today, along with the University of Chicago. We work with Envoy in places like Philadelphia and Phoenix, and Matt, you'll tell me where else we work with you. But we're really leaning into the fact that employers, while they make commitments at a firm-wide level, the hiring happens obviously at the local level. And so that's why we need to strengthen those employer and community-based organization partnerships in the places where the hiring is going on.
So then maybe that's a great segue into then the policy landscape and recognizing that there's a lot of practice change that can happen, but then also policy, and certainly the center has been deeply involved in a number of policy efforts. Do you want to share a little bit about that, and we can turn to the video?
Sure. Right, so my day job is actually public policy, which is one of the most important aspects of the work of the holistic approach that JPMorgan takes to this work. We worked on legislation starting with our own industry, the Fair Hiring and Banking Act, which we can talk a little bit more about, but that made some common sense reforms within the financial services industry for hiring people with records. And then we also do a lot of work on clean slate legislation. We've worked on bills that have passed in roughly 8 states. We're working, we have friends in Illinois. We'd love to help you pass clean slate here. We're obviously a big employer here. And one of the most, the employer voice is really important when it comes to public policy changes, because we're able to explain to policymakers how changes like Clean Slate, which actually works with the Fair Hiring and Banking Act, because what the Fair Hiring and Banking Act allows companies to do is set aside records that have either been sealed or expunged, so long as they're not major financial crimes. Just to be clear, we want to keep the financial system safe and sound, and our customers safe and sound. But so these are policies that actually work together. And one of the ways that we've and it's also important to us just as a firm, it's part of our values as a firm. But we also think it's important, both with the Second Chance Business Coalition and with JPMorgan, to send the demand signal. What my colleague Michelle Caranti spoke about yesterday is we need to send the demand signal as a firm that hiring people, making sure that people with records are part of our inclusive hiring strategy is we want them to be part of our inclusive hiring strategy. We want them to be on our team. We operate in 50 states across the country. We are always looking for top talent. Skills first hiring was mentioned. We are a skills first employer. And so, policies like Clean Slate legislation are very important. But we also recognize, and this was talked to, I know it was suggested that JPMorgan Chase do a Super Bowl ad yesterday, and my response was, well, we've actually already done an award-winning film called The Waiting Workforce, which I think we'd love to show all of you. It's about 2 minutes, so hopefully it's not too long, but this film reflects why we do this work, because it's important to the communities that we serve as a financial institution. It makes an impact on people's individual lives, their ability to work, their ability to buy a house, get a car, get an education, get health care. It impacts so many, get a driver's license. So it really is, this film really demonstrates why we do this work.
So I think we'll go ahead.
I was a 19-year-old kid. I had never been in trouble before.
18 years old, just smoking weed in the dorms.
Now I had a permanent record, and I had to deal with that.
Couldn't vote. I couldn't be a taxi cab driver.
You don't get housing opportunities.
Me trying to get jobs, well, it followed me.
I began to go through this expungement process, and every step costs money. Every step takes time.
It can cost upwards of $10,000 per case.
Do I have the means to do it? Do I need an attorney?
And all you are is paperwork.
When I actually walked up to this piece and I see all these people, faceless and nameless, I look at that sculpture and I say, that is me. I feel like one of these people who's constantly waiting.
Like, those are people burdened by mountains of documents, mountains of paper.
For me, clean slate legislation would mean a new lease on life.
Educational opportunities, employment opportunities, housing opportunities, and would be life-changing.
It touches you very deeply to understand that there is maybe a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, my second chance is definitely coming.
You might have done some wrong. Doesn't mean that you can't change and do some right.
So Nan, I had just one more question, and then we'll transition to Reginald. What are some of the lessons for other policies that might incent employers to hire employees with records of arrest and conviction?
Sure. Well, I think that video kind of, or that film sort of demonstrated the point is that, as I mentioned, we're a skills-first employer. Most of the employers who we work with are looking for the best talent that they can attract to the jobs that they have, so that they can deliver the products and the services to their customers. And so I think we would encourage, as I mentioned, the employee voice is very important when it comes to public policy. And we would encourage more employers to join us in working on clean slate legislation. We're also working with other across other industries, looking at in-demand careers. So, for example, the healthcare careers. There's a tremendous demand in our economy for healthcare careers, and we're looking at the opportunity to transfer some of the learnings that we've had with making, common sense changes in our industry, and looking for opportunities to make changes in other industries. So I think that, in general, companies, they want to find the best talent, and I think, but they don't necessarily, there's still a tremendous stigma that's attached to having a criminal record. As I mentioned, we've probably hired about 15,000 people over the last, 4 or 5 years that have a criminal record, and exactly 2 people have been willing to self-ID in that time, which just tells it, at a company like ours that makes videos or films, we talk about it every day. Our CEO writes about it in his shareholder letter, and still the stigma is so tremendous that it's. I think that's one of the things where we really, people say companies, but it's really people who are doing the hiring. It's the public consciousness that we really need to penetrate, and we really need to shift public attitudes even more about this. And I think, when 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record, we all know somebody who has a record. We all know somebody who either needs a second chance, or they probably could have even used a first chance. So the more that we can do to destigmatize having a record, I think the more it will just help everyone in this room, in addition to helping companies attract the best talent.
Reginald, from your role, you're working directly with employers on their fair chance hiring efforts. Curious what you've seen in terms of policies that are incentivizing their work. Do the employers that you're working with know about the bonding program we just spoke about, that Jen spoke about, the tax credits? Curious what you're hearing and what might move more employers that you're partnering with to do this work.
Sure. So I'll start off by just saying thank you to Jennifer. I came up here today planning to explain a lot of the complexities with my security blanket here. Thought I was going to have to read off, so thank you for that great setup. I think it's important to know also my firm manages the wage subsidy and on-the-job training program that Jennifer mentioned throughout North Carolina. We partner in the DMV, Georgia, as well as Texas, but we actually administer the program. And so for us, one of the things that we start with is what companies can most benefit from some of the subsidies that we talked about today, right? Some of the large organizations, a $5,000 tax credit may be more of a headache than worth them pursuing. And so we go down the list to say, well, for us, it's really those small and micro businesses that can benefit the most from some of the incentives that Jennifer mentioned earlier today. And the one thing that we do differently is, has anybody ever shopped online for an electric vehicle, or just browsed, or whatever the case may be? So one of the things that they do, doesn't matter who the manufacturer is, they present the potential savings as a part that's baked into the price. So they'll say the cost of the vehicle minus the potential cost of gas and maintenance, and so they present to you by default the cost with the savings baked in. And so that's one of the things that we do, is when we're communicating some of the incentives that Jennifer mentioned, we present, so let's just say if you're paying somebody $25 an hour. So we say that $25 an hour minus the potential $5,000 tax credit, minus the potential, we manage the wage subsidy program, and we subsidize wages up to 75%. So an agreement with an employer could be worth $15,000. So we say $5,000 minus the $15,000 minus the bonding is the actual cost of that employee. And in other cases, we actually take it a step further because there's a cost of acquisition. So there's a TA cost associated with that. And so, depending on where you are, that cost can be, I don't know, anywhere from $2,500 to $5,500. So we communicate up front, here's the total cost of all the incentives baked in. And then we have the conversation, particularly with the small business owners. But we find the most success presenting that information holistically to organizations who could benefit the most financially from it.
And maybe just a word about those subsidies. Who are you partnering with? I know you mentioned a couple of locations. Just share a little bit more about who's funding this work.
Yeah, so the majority of the work we have is really funded by the Department of Labor. So it's a DOL funded through the local workforce board. So in our case, in North Carolina, it's NC Works. And so we partner with them to really, we manage the process of communicating and attracting the small businesses. And we manage the process of communicating those opportunities to the CBOs. And so for an example, if Pete was in here earlier, we were talking about the process. So if a coffee roaster, for an example, is looking for somebody to do coffee roasting, they need somebody has attention to detail, so forth and so on. So we work with the business community to say, well, what exactly are you looking for? Not just what's on the job description, but who's the ideal candidate? What are some of the competencies that you're looking for? And then we go back to our community-based organization network to say, well, you guys have X training program. We're looking for 5 people with these skill sets for these jobs in this location. Here are the wages, so forth and so on. So we manage both the supply side, the communicating to those, and then managing the demand side, particularly with the small business community. But it's funded by the Department of Labor.
Great. And any other new incentives, or curious about your reactions to what Jennifer laid out around rehabilitation certificates or letters of reference? Curious how those would work in your context.
I definitely took a note down on the rehabilitation certificate because we work with really a population with chronic barriers. So yes, we work with individuals that have been involved in the justice system, but we serve our veteran community. We serve individuals aging out of foster care, but the largest population we serve are really non-college bound or undecided high school students. And our thought there is if we can have a proactive approach, we're kind of not talking about second chance employment because we created the pathway on the front end, but that certificate or rehabilitation or some type of certification that simply validates somebody has gone through a process for rehabilitation. I love that idea.
Great, thank you. Evan, want to get you into this conversation. So you are a labor economist, and your research focuses on discrimination and inequality. Curious about if you could share a little bit about some of your recent work and where you think there might be some opportunities that we are missing out on. Certainly Jennifer gave us a call to action, but curious from your perch, what are some opportunities?
Great, yeah. So thanks, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I've just learned so much in the last 24 hours that it's been a phenomenal opportunity. Let me answer your question by sort of trying to connect a couple themes from what Jen said and what's been said on the table so far. It's clear that when we think about public policy, one question is clearly what we do. Are we going to subsidize wages, provide certificates of rehabilitation? But what seems to often matter more is just how you do it. So WOTC is a wage subsidy. Employers will respond to wage subsidies, but only if it's there and it's actually it's making a difference on the margin for their hiring decision. If it's all ex post, it's just money you get, sort of gravy after you've already found a candidate you wanted to hire to begin with, then it's not going to make a difference. If the subsidies are more salient, like Reg was talking about, that you can actually see this is the sort of sticker price and the price I'm actually paying, we know from a huge literature in behavioral economics that's going to have a big impact there. Other policies like clean slate and expunction, historically take-ups of those types of programs have been enormously low because the administrative hurdles just to get there are it's frankly insane in some states. So go look at what New York State requires you to in order to get a certificate of rehabilitation from their departments of corrections. It's probably harder than getting a degree from UChicago at the moment. It's an incredibly burdensome process. Now, there's some value in raising the cost of getting the certificates, as Jen mentioned, then you sort of increase the selection. The people who make it through that selection process are going to be, the very cream of the crop. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, have we drawn that line in the right place? Are we targeting these policies in the right place? My gut instinct says no, and there's a lot of room for experimentation, both the totally new policies we haven't even considered yet, some of the ideas that are coming up around, but also tinkering with the policies we have now, sometimes in a way that's budget neutral so that it's easier to get through the political system, but it's going to increase the bang for the buck for the things we're already doing, like certificates of rehabilitation, like WOTC, and so on. The other comment I think I wanted to make is that Jen set this up beautifully. Economists traditionally do think about government intervention as being motivated by market failures or some externality that's not being internalized. And I promise this will not become another econ lecture, at least not for very long. There's a second motivation for why government intervenes in the economy, and that's redistribution. We want to live in a world that's more equal than the world that's arisen due to natural market forces on their own. And a theme that I come back to in my research constantly, and I think I keep seeing in other work by academics in this space, is that the degree of concentrated inequality among individuals who interact with the justice system is just frankly astounding. And it's not just the fact that individuals are dealing with a felony conviction, they're dealing with a legacy of structural disadvantage and lifetime barriers that have been put up from growing up in impoverished neighborhoods, being abandoned by public education systems, having limited formal experience in the labor market, where even if you could delete the presence of the record from their job history, maybe all those other challenges would be so insurmountable that actually breaking back into the labor market would be an enormous challenge. So there's things we need to do in order to help the individuals who are job ready today. You know, this sort of diamonds in the rough is a phrase that's been used a few times over the course of this conference. Break into this labor market and achieve the types of success that lead them to the upper echelons of Nike. But we also need public policy that's going to fashion more diamonds out of the rough that's out there and discover this latent potential and build those skills in human capital. You know, some work we've done recently, what we found is that individuals who are at risk of incarceration, so they're convicted of a felony and they could have gone to prison, but instead were given a probation sentence. Over the next decade, on average, that population is going to make about $5,000 per year and see almost no wage growth in that entire decade. So things are dire. It's a desperate situation. In some work that we're going to be releasing in the next couple of months, we show that plausibly a lot of the explanatory factors for those low levels of earnings are things, challenges and barriers that were present prior to the individual first acquiring the record to begin with. So the record matters. Yes, all these things matter. We need to be thinking about clean slate policies. We need to be thinking about ways that make it easier to deal with that part of the labor market. We also need to think about policies that actually invest in human capital and skills and make this population somebody that an employer would be excited to hire, no matter what is going on with their criminal record in the past. And I don't mean to suggest that that's easy. The literature on active labor market policies is definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. It's hard to do real cost-effective skills and training. I know many people in this room are working on programs that exactly try to do that, but in my view, if we want to see real transformative change, we have to tinker at the margins. We have to make it easier for the people who are job ready to break into the labor market, but we also have to invest in the people who have that potential but haven't had that investment yet so that they can make a positive contribution. And the motivation for doing that is making a meaningful difference in terms of inequality.
Reginald, I wanted to go back to you. We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about data and data accessibility. I'm curious, the partners that you're working with, are those employers tracking data with the candidates that you're working with? And curious, how having additional information about the outcomes for those particular participants, would that then encourage more employers to take up some of those incentives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to go back to kind of Nan's point earlier. And so the role that we play in the ecosystem, we sit in the middle of the ecosystem and we have a platform that we collect the data and we can share it across employers, city, county, municipalities. And so we actually collect the data, hold the data. And so we don't get caught up in the bureaucracy of, well, it's our data, it's not your data. And so again, that's our role in the ecosystem. We sit in the middle, we have the system that we created to collect the data so we can manage the outcomes, we can manage post-employment, or even if they've gone to another employer, we can still check in with them to see how are they doing, do they need other supportive services, so forth and so on.
That's great. So basically we need Reginald working in all regions, all across the country. Nan, I wanted to turn the question to you about data. And I know that's something that SEBC has been working a great deal on. You all are also doing a lot of work internally at JPMorgan Chase. What type of data do we need to have access to, and where might that move some particular policy interventions?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of, is this on actually? I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think this one's working either. Anyway.
Try
we
one
could
more
just,
time.
hello?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, there we go. So data, I heart data. I'm not an economist, all my friends are economists. So I think, one, and I know there's a lot of talk about having access to employer data yesterday, so we'll set that aside for today, and we'll talk a little bit about the dearth of government data, basically, that's available, if that's okay with everybody. I mean, actually, and I just happened, and I caught Sean beforehand because I was like, why is there not a question on the, the CPS about, we know there's an annual, BLS publishes an annual report about the labor market conditions for people with disabilities, people who are veterans. Like, we have a lot of government collected statistical data about lots of different types of people in or not in the labor market, or the labor market conditions for them. And we don't have anything really about criminal justice that's collected by the BLS, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And so it does strike me that there is an opportunity. I know that there are challenges to it, which Sean will be much more articulate about than I could be. But it does seem that, if the numbers that are done by piecing it together are it's what we have, so it's what we got, it's what we're going with, right? Like 70 to 80 million people. That's 3-4 times as many people who are veterans and 3-4 times as many people who have disabilities. So it does seem like there is an obligation on the part of the government to collect these data somehow or figure it out. And I know there's been a million conferences about it. So point number one is it does seem like there is an opportunity for that. The one and one place where we might start, or maybe start a new thread of a conversation, is with the Federal Reserve, which has an Institute for Economic Inequality, is that right? Run by Bill Rogers, an economist, used to be the chief economist at the Labor Department, I think during the Obama administration. And some of you have heard the story, so sorry if this is a repeat, but so Patrick Harker, who's the current president of the Philadelphia Fed, held a community listening session, and he invited us and a lot of folks from Wilmington to participate. And at that meeting, he told us that 54% of the population of Wilmington has a criminal record. So, right, I about fell out of my chair when he said that. So Delaware is home to many financial institutions. There are FDIC hiring rules that require us to do a background check to see if someone has, what their criminal history is. And so basically what the president of the Philadelphia Fed told us, and all the other companies in the room, is roughly half the population may not be available to you to go to work at your firm, which explains why we and many other companies had a lot of vacancies. And so we have recently embarked on like an equitable hiring initiative within Wilmington and building out that ecosystem within Wilmington with our partners like RBIJ and others, trying to figure out, how, it's not solely second chance, but that's an aspect of it. How do we do that? So there's more of a role, I would say, for government to step in, and I know it's not easy, having worked in government for a long time, but it does seem like there is more work that could be done there. The second point I would just make is, with the Second Chance Business Coalition, we did sort of insist on having a benchmarking survey so we survey the companies, but the way that we could get companies to agree to it, obviously, is if it was anonymized and aggregated data. And we publish a few statistics from that annually, and there will be a new one coming out probably in April during Second Chance Month. But this is also a don't get too excited, researchers, because it's an extremely limited data set. But we do think it's important to capture data on the companies, even if it's anonymous and aggregated. And JPMorgan Chase is just one of the few companies that it's willing to go out and talk about the data. We keep getting asked for more data, but I'm pretty sure what you got is what you're gonna get. But yeah, we would always like more data, but I do think that there's a bigger role that government can play there as well.
Data, so I completely agree. There's an enormous data vacuum out there for just understanding the scope and size of this problem, the dimensions of the population who's impacted. You want to do the kind of segmentation we've been talking about the past couple of days. You have to have the data to drill down into different groups and understand who's where and how they're being impacted. I think we're making progress on the government's end, and I just want to take a quick second to highlight the work that the Census Bureau has been doing recently on this topic. So through the monumental effort of a couple academic researchers, they've been hoovering up massive amounts of local crime and justice data from court systems and police agencies all across the country, merging that into census data. One of the reasons why this is such a difficult problem is that the US criminal justice system is so incredibly balkanized. You might have somebody convicted in one city and convicted in another, and there's no way to actually figure out whether or not that's the same person. It takes a lot of data work to be able to do those linkages carefully. Census has made some of those data products public. There's this thing called the Justice Outcomes Explorer, produced by the Criminal Justice Administrative Research Repository or something. Maybe Jen can correct me. CJARS.
CJARS, University of Michigan.
Yes, and that's available to the public now. You can go check that out. There's incredible statistics about things like, what share of the cohort born between these years in the state was convicted of a felony by the time they were X years old. And so we're making progress in that thing, but there's still an enormous way to go. It's helpful for motivating research. It's also helpful for crafting policy. If you want to design policy around financial regulation and think about, should this type of record be exclusionary and this type not, it's good to know, well, how many people are actually going to be impacted by the regulation when we write it that way? And that's a difficult question to answer in the current state of affairs.
And I think that another plug for CJARS, that's jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So exactly what Evan was saying, and an opportunity to think about this ecosystem approach. If we're going to do this work within a particular city or within a particular state, what are some ways that we could be able to leverage those data tools and link them together? I know we want to get to audience questions, so maybe I'll just do one quick rapid fire and then give you all a moment to prepare your questions. So each of you would love for you to respond. What is one question that, if answered, would improve public policy to encourage companies to hire those with records? Reginald, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Nan. So I want to go back to the comment that the young lady made earlier on getting the information in the hands of the job seeker, right? And so we've touched, 250 small businesses. We've placed 100 individuals. And not one time had I thought about getting this information in the hands of the folks who are actually trying to make decisions about their life, right? And so it's less of a policy change, more of a common sense approach, right? We have the data, we have the information, why aren't we? So thank you for that point, because that's really an easy solution, at least for us.
Thank you, Roxanne, for that. We're all going to be quoting you on that moving forward. Evan?
I think in keeping with the answer I gave initially, I would want to know what is the most important skill deficit that can be most effectively addressed by programming and both provided by public policy and by CSOs and other organizations and by academics. In particular, what kind of skills that we could actually be addressing, skill deficits could we be addressing while people are interacting with the justice system. I mean, one of the travesties of mass incarceration is not just the human cost, the enormous cost to society, but that individuals spend a couple of years in prison and get out and roughly return, in most cases, to status quo, the best research suggests. No better or worse than they were if they'd spent 2 or 3 years on probation instead. It's a huge missed opportunity to not give people the skills they need to go succeed in the labor market, but we need the research to understand what those skills would be and how could we actually build them in an effective way.
Yeah, and I'm gonna follow your lead and go back to where I started, which is it's really important for employers to understand what the local labor market looks like, and that the information that the Federal Reserve was able to provide in Wilmington was extremely helpful in our ability to figure out what are the local solutions that we need to be pursuing on the ground. How do we really need to be thinking about our talent strategy in that location based on that information? I'll just do a quick little plug. We have a tremendous legal pro bono team, and we hold expungement clinics in our community branches. We actually started, the pilot was right here in Chicago in Stony Island, because all good things start in Chicago. We did a large-scale clinic. We served about 200 people at the Chase Center in Wilmington, the Chase Fieldhouse in Wilmington, because we recognized the scale of the problem. But going back to what's the policy we need, like not even JPMorgan has enough lawyers to clear all the records that are eligible to be cleared. So that's why we need, clean slate legislation so that we can use technology to clear the records that are eligible and available to be cleared so that we can reduce some of the friction in the labor market and, get people their jobs, education, and that they need, and housing that they need to live productive lives.
Can I add a point?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So just as I listen to the conversation, I'd love to add a point to the policy. Navigating the ecosystem or lack thereof, it's difficult. On the business side, we tend to say, oh, there's a lot of training providers and CBOs out there, go find them. And on the job seeker side, we tend to say, oh, there's a lot of jobs out there, go find them, right? So just navigating systems is difficult for any of us with access to technology. So throw a couple barriers, no technology on the equation. So from a policy standpoint, there's enough technological advances in our country that we can simplify the navigation process.
Love that. Love that. We're going to open up to questions.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your comments. I had a question or a thought and a question, and I wanted to preface the thought and the question by saying that I do understand and am sensitive to the employer concerns. And I wanted to ask you all how you all think about things like certificates of rehabilitation and stigma, right? Because in part it seems to me to be a little tension there, because these certificates of rehabilitation, depending on who the person is or what the context of their life is, coming with a certificate of rehabilitation might be more of an arduous task for some than for others. And so, yeah, I was just thinking that, because I think people with criminal records, myself included, always are carrying around some certificate of rehabilitation or something that is, quote, proof of rehabilitation. And so I just wanted you all to think with me about, the implications of that and having to prove all the time that you are indeed rehabilitated.
Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to start. I think one of the ways that economists look at a policy like that is not just trying to understand the average impact, what happened to sort of the typical person who got it, but the distributional impacts, right? And it's not easy to imagine, or hard to imagine a scenario with things like certificates of rehabilitation, is that the people who get it are going to excel. And now if you're an employer, you're not going to hire anybody who doesn't have one. And so for people for whom that's unavailable, it comes at a cost. In aggregate, that may be a good thing, but those distributional consequences are real and the kind of thing we have to take account of. I don't think we know how bad that problem could be or how we might mitigate it, because I think a lot of the evaluations of these types of programs are just not there at the moment. But it's a completely real concern and something you'd want to think about when building that.
Yeah, if I can add to that. So that's a great point that you brought up. Thank you for that. When I heard certificate of rehabilitation, I translated that to certificate of readiness. Right, and so for me, when I'm talking to employers or when somebody on my team's talking to employers, we're saying, hey, we have a pipeline of work-ready talent. And so for me, what I translated that to is kind of we have proof of readiness, and readiness is subjective, right? So have they gone through training program? Have they gone through a mental health, like whatever that readiness is. So I translated that to certification of readiness. So as I'm talking to, again, employers, I can say these folks are ambitious, talented, and work ready.
Thank you for that, Quentin. I think it's a couple of things that has gone through my mind since I've been here. What Roxanne said, and then your comment that you had never thought about it. And I think about public policy, how sometimes decisions are made about us without us. And so there are times when you don't get that insight from individuals that are directly impacted. And we've been talking a lot about skill sets, and I think the lived experience is one of the most profound skill sets that an individual can have. But I also want to address kind of like this thing that was said earlier, that second chance or clean slate legislation doesn't work. You have to think about who you're talking about. And so when I think about the clean slate legislation, for me, it wouldn't work. It was impossible for me to hide my conviction and reentry, you know? And so I think for some individuals, there's a both and in this room. You know, there are those who would rather not self-disclose. And so do we force what we do on them because I choose to self-disclose? You know, and I think that as we think about policy and as we think about the research, that we really ought to think about, you know, individuals that have served their time get an opportunity to say what works for them. You know, a researcher does not get to say clean slate doesn't work for me if you don't have a record. Because I may go to an employer with my record expunged and I don't want them to know about it, you know? And so that piece, but also I think this is for you, Nan, and everyone up there. When we think about fair chance hiring, you know, and women being the primary caregivers of their children before, during, and after incarceration, how are we thinking about women in this, you know, huge thing? Because a lot of times when we think about that fair chance hiring piece, we think sometimes we're thinking, you know, more male-centered, and it's really heavily male-focused. So I just want to put that on the radar and put that out there and see, like, if there is, you know, like these second chances happening, what is the percentage of women, you know, that are being employed, and, you know, are they retaining the employment? And also thinking about fair chance hirers that support women holistically with childcare and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great point. I can tell you that without disclosing the location, because we're very concerned about protecting the privacy of our employees, and just if you could indulge me like 30 seconds. So we're a ban-the-box employer. We don't do a background check until a conditional offer of employment has been made, which means we're really pretty sure that that's the person that we want to do that job and they have the skills to do that job. And then that's when the background check is done, only after the conditional offer of employment has been made. And so there's a dedicated team that does that screening. So the hiring manager does not know if an individual who is brought onto the firm has a criminal record. Only people who know are that dedicated team. And that's where where I said, like, we've hired 15,000 people, but only 2 people have disclosed to us that they have a record, which is totally their prerogative. What we went into a certain area recently where we stood up a specific business unit, and that specific business unit was drawn from a heavily urban area, and it over-indexed. So I said 10% of our new hires. So in this particular area, it was closer to like 35% of the new hires were people with records. And they also over-indexed being female. And exactly. And so, what we do know in some cases where we place a business unit, where we know we're going to be hiring, doing a significant number of hires for a specific business purpose, and we think about the placement because we are thinking about that community and helping to strengthen that community. And so I can tell you that I do know that there are examples where we have been very intentional about supporting the population, the exact population that you're talking about. The one other thing I should be clear about is, when we say 70 to million people have records. Obviously not all of those people have been to prison. And just to be clear, because of our regulatory framework, we're hiring people, if they were ever in prison, when we hire them, they're much further away from that experience, typically, I would imagine. One of the reasons why we want to work with companies in the Second Chance Business Coalition and promote these policies, because we know that there are companies in other industries that don't have the same regulatory framework that we have, and they are able to hire people right out of prison. And so that's why we understand like that, and that's why the ecosystems are so important, because maybe somebody's not ready for our talent pipeline right away. Maybe they've got to go, they're going to go work someplace else before, and they're going to get good skills and good work experience, and then they're going to come, after that prison experience, and then they're going to come work for like a JPMorgan with, great, benefits and salaries and career pathways that are available to folks. So I hope that answers your question. And the clean slate point, I think, is it's reducing friction in the system. If you have to report that, if you have to check that box, if you're applying somewhere that's not a ban-the-box employer, then it does create friction in the system. And we have seen a measurable, meaningful difference in both our ability to hire people as a result of the Fair Hiring and Banking Act, which does allow us to set aside records that have been sealed or expunged, again, as long as it's not like a big money crime, because we all want our money to be safe, and we all want our customers to be safe and things like that. So, but those two policies work together, very well and in a meaningful way. And if you don't think public policy matters, this is my last point, when the Fair Hiring and Banking Act passed, somebody in the one thing I do know, only because we provided this as an example to the banking committee, was there was somebody literally in the queue who was like, we wouldn't have been able to hire them but for the stroke of the president's pen that day. And so we were literally able to hire someone because of the passage of the fair. I mean, it happened in real time. And so that just tells you how important public policy really is, and I'm going to hand it back.
It makes me think, let me just piggyback one thing. Last night with Larry and Ken's panel, how that 1% of individuals that may be charged or had been convicted of a violent crime, and the rate of them reoffending or being reincarcerated is less than 1%. I think the challenge for all fair chance hiring is that looking at that population too, regardless of what the charge was or what the crime was, and then seeing Ken came home in 2019, so did I. And so just making sure that we look at that population to say this is someone that I can hire regardless to what happened 25 years ago, that they are a good hire, and making sure we kind of look at that 1%, that demographic, and know that the recidivism rate is less than 1%. I think I'm finished now, you all.
I mean, and
for now.
Yeah, and I was almost finished too until you said. But it goes back to it goes back, or maybe you and I should just go like But it goes back to the perception, right? We know that there are companies I talk to companies all the time. Like, we have a regulatory framework that we follow. I talk to companies and I ask them, what are the regulatory barriers that you have to hiring people with records? And sometimes the answer is, oh, we don't have any regulatory barriers. And I'm like, okay, so what's the problem? And it's cultural. It is internal culture and having to rearrange or reset the internal culture. And I guess one really quick thing, just to reinforce something that was said yesterday, is our CEO, our CHRO, and importantly, our general counsel are all very strong proponents of second chance hiring. I mean, all three of them send the message to their staff this is important to the firm. This is our value.